Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with Matt King about various kinds of responsibility and how they all share in what he calls the basic responsibility relation.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Matt King, professor of philosophy at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. Matt's research focuses on the nature and the role of moral responsibility, and he's published papers on blame, the standing to blame, moral responsibility and mental illness, manipulation arguments, and several other topics that regular listeners will be familiar with from this podcast. Matt is the co-editor with Josh May of a book called Agency in Mental Disorder, Philosophical Dimensions, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2022. And Matt has also published a monograph called Simply Responsible, Basic Blame, Scant Praise, and Minimal Agency, also published by Oxford University Press, this one in 2023. And using his book as a starting off point, we're going to ask Matt all about what he calls the basic responsibility relation in our episode today. So welcome to the show, Matt. Could you start by telling us a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to free will and moral responsibility?
Yeah, thanks. First off, thanks for having me on the show. I'm excited to be here.
Of course, yeah.
I came to philosophy, I suppose, reasonably early as it is for in comparison to lots of other philosophers. Mm-hmm. So I was lucky enough to have a high school semester survey course elective in philosophy, which
that's cool.
For if you're by now your listeners are familiar with at least some of philosophy. So it was a semester-long high school course that started with Plato and ended with Nietzsche. So it was not in depth by any stretch of the imagination. It was like a week on two things at a time. But I got really excited about philosophy in that course because it seemed like the kinds of questions we were asking and the way of approaching those questions, finally, it was like an aha moment. Like, oh, this is really cool and exciting. So then when I went to college, I just started taking philosophy courses right off the bat. And 2 courses became 3 courses. And then eventually I started thinking about, well, this seems really fun. How would you stay doing this for as long as possible? And that meant the grind through graduate school, and I'm lucky enough to still be here after all those years. By contrast, I got into sort of thinking about agency and responsibility and free will fairly late in graduate school. I went to graduate school thinking I was going to be doing political philosophy. But like so many of us who get gripped with these issues, I was in a graduate seminar and we read Peter Strawson's Freedom and Resentment, which is a jumping off inspiration point for so many people I talk to who work on these things. And I remember thinking I really liked his proposal or his approach in that piece. And I remember agreeing with him about one thing and then massively disagreeing with him about everything that he did with that one thing. And that sort of kicked off this, what has now been, over a decade of my life thinking about sort of questions of responsibility and related issues across the spectrum of philosophy.
Yeah, very cool. The proposal of your book is that there's one basic responsibility relation. As you put it, the blameworthy artist is responsible in just the same way that the blameworthy thief is. So could you say more about this proposal and why you take it to be a radical one?
Yeah, so the kind of basic idea, and if anyone goes on to read the book, you'll see that term just pops up everywhere in the book. Just basic, it's this conceit of the book that I just make everything the basic thing, and then it makes it sound like, well, it's just innocuous. It's the basic responsibility relation. So it gets you a bunch of fundamentality on the cheap just by naming things the right way.
Basic.
But the basic proposal is that we do things in the world, and the things that we do can get assessed in various ways. They can get assessed morally, they can get assessed artistically, culinarily. There's all sorts of ways and standards, norms that we can apply to evaluate the things that we do. And the idea behind the basic responsibility relation is that there's this core relation that we stand in to the things that we do that allows assessment of the things that we do in a particular way. And it's a quite general kind of relation, and it means that sort of the ways in which, or the kinds of things that we do, those different kinds of standards all depend on the same kind of relation. So the relation is sort of neutral across the board, and it allows all of our conduct to be assessed by these various standards. The reason why I think it's radical, there's sort of two principal ways in which I think it's radical. So one is that those that are familiar with the responsibility literature, and especially the responsibility literature, maybe up until 5 years or so ago, responsibility is this heavily moralized notion. In fact, standardly, if someone writes on moral responsibility, one of the first things they do is contrast the thing that they're interested in with non-moral types of responsibility, whether that's causal responsibility, legal responsibility, to hone in on the very thing that they're interested in. And it's a moralized notion. And then the conditions on that notion of responsibility, what it takes to be morally responsible, then tend to end up being moralized conditions, turning on our moral capacities, our capacities for moral thought or moral feeling. And so you get this very sort of morally loaded kind of conception. The kinds of examples and cases that they want to talk about are always morally loaded cases like murder and the like. And, you'll have theorists that even sort of get very close to the sort of thing that I want to say in the book. So R.J. Wallace has this famous passage in his book on moral responsibility where he says the artist is responsible in this deep sort of fundamental way, but that's not moral responsibility. No one would say that the artist is morally blameworthy for bad art. And he sort of just, excludes it from the get-go.
Right.
And so my proposal is quite radical because it cuts against this. It says, actually, no, the exact opposite is true. Moral responsibility isn't this distinctive type of responsibility. There is just this basic responsibility relation that moral responsibility is one sort of application of it rather than the central notion. And it's also radical in this less familiar use of the word radical, which is related to sort of being at the root of things. And so my proposal is really trying to get at, in my view, responsibility. The thing that I'm interested in is this sort of core notion. There's a kind of fundamentality to it. And so that it gets to the heart of things in the way that sort of radical notions do.
Right.
It's also super cool. I think I have a footnote that, radical also, from my 90s generation, radical just meant super, extremely cool. So it's also extremely cool.
That's rad. Yeah. That's awesome. That's a helpful way of characterizing the view. You already mentioned the case of an artist who's kind of done bad art. What are some other examples of people being responsible for things, both in moral and in the non-moral sense? And what are some of the parallels across the moral and the non-moral cases?
Yeah, so I think a helpful place to sort of see the deep parallels between moral and non-moral responsibility is to start with artistic cases. So we're in the middle. We're recording this in late January. We're still in the middle of awards season, and every awards season, there's disagreement about sort of like who should have been awarded whatever it is, best, the Oscars or whatever, and there'll be disagreements that sure look a lot like disagreements that we might have in the moral realm about who was. We don't tend to set the same kind of standards. We're not often like looking around our friends trying to figure out like, well, who's the best friend in terms of like achieving the platonic form of friend or something like that. But we do often have disagreements about like who's making good decisions or good choices, whose sort of moral conduct towards us or towards others sort of satisfies the kinds of standards we want to apply. One parallel I like to draw is that if you think about a standard moral case, like in a murder mystery, there's a kind of, it's a whodunit, and you're trying to figure out like, well, who's the person not only who's like was the genesis of this crime, but would be the appropriate person to be like angry at or to blame or to, try and bring to justice or something like that. And then you can compare that to a case where you're in a museum and you see like this striking piece of art and you're like, oh, that is really cool. And like the next thing you might do is like look around for the little placard that tells you like the name of the work, but also like who the artist is. And if you're not already familiar, you might try to figure out like, well, who did this thing? Like who? And you might even say something like, well, I wonder who's responsible for this. And in part trying to identify like the person to whom we're going to direct our praise, things that sort of routinely look like praise. Another common place where I think we see a lot of the behavioral markers of moral responsibility is in sports. So I used an example early in the book. It's a dated example and actually not one that I'm personally all that attached to. I'm not a huge baseball fan, and this sort of comes before my time, but lots of folks will know the story of Bill Buckner, who played for the Red Sox and sort of misses what is an easy ground ball, and they end up losing the playoff game and go on to lose the series. And in real life, Bill Buckner had to like move because out in the world, he would be accosted. And it sure looked like the sort of thing that you might expect in a courtroom when the families of those who have been wronged by the perpetrator, yell and direct their anger at him. And so that's sort of the superficial kind of phenomenological parallels between moral and non-moral cases. I pointed to Strawson earlier. I think one of the things that's most striking about the parallels between the moral and non-moral cases is that the same kinds of considerations that would lead us to sort of disrupt those responses, to think that the person in question really doesn't or shouldn't be praised or blamed for the conduct in question, are the same across the cases, especially in these like core instances. So if I have a muscle spasm and I slap Taylor because we're riding in the elevator and it's a close quarters and I have some kind of seizure. Well, that's the sort of thing where plausibly I have this kind of excuse, right? It's this like involuntary muscle reaction. And similarly, right, if I sort of am chiseling as a sculptor and then I have some muscle spasm and now the sculpture's ruined, we'd say like, well, that doesn't really it's not something I'm to be blamed for. We don't look at that and then go like, well, he's not a very good sculptor, I guess. Like what a terrible looking piece of art. And we can do this for other kinds of core cases too. Like, true accidents tend to undermine blameworthiness, but the same holds true in non-moral cases. So like no one confuses Jackson Pollock's paintings with the drop cloths in his studio or something like that, right? If someone had mistakenly grabbed the drop cloth from his house painting project and put it up and like, oh, we've got a new Jackson Pollock, they'd be making some kind of mistake, because that's not something that he in fact did in the relevant sort of way. And drawing on these parallels, we can sort of see this kind of core notion where we direct our agency on the world. And that kind of direction, that kind of connection, what I call the basic responsibility relation, doesn't really care about what the evaluative domain that we're in, whether it's the moral or the non-moral.
Yeah, so these examples of the muscle spasm where you are not in control kind of leads us to this question about the basic responsibility requiring like a kind of control over our activities. So what are the conditions? Are there other conditions besides like a kind of control that you have to have over your behavior?
Yeah, so the methodology in the book is to sort of look at these parallel, what we might call excuses. There are these parallel sets of instances or circumstances or features that would sort of disrupt this basic relation between ourselves and what we might call conduct, or something that, broadly speaking, we do.
Right.
And I sort of propose that we work backwards. And this is actually essentially what sort of Peter Strawson does in Freedom and Resentment, is sort of look at these like core excuses and then work backwards. And the main difference here is that I think like they just hold across all these domains. So if you take the case of a spasm, one of the things that plausibly shows is that in order to be responsible for something, it has to fall under, we can call it control just to stipulate something, right? Or to stipulate a term, but it has to sort of be part of our, what I call guided activity. It sort of has to run through our psychology in the right sort of way. And so spasms don't really run through our psychology. Right? They might involve the brain doing stuff, of course, but it doesn't sort of run through our psychology in any meaningful sense. It's not sensitive to our representations of the world. It's not sensitive to any sort of mental categories. It's just a muscle spasm. And so broadly, I think what that tells us is that the basic responsibility relation is going to be sensitive to psychological representations. So it has to be part or tied to only things that are part of our guided activity. And throughout the book, I'm always using sort of the most minimal version of the thing that I'm talking about. So guided activity is really minimal. It's just sort of, right, guided by our psychologies and in some sense or another. And that also usefully puts the kinds of things that the basic responsibility relation can tie us to things that we sort of do in a more meaningful sense than just sort of true action verbs about us, right? So in the example I gave, I said I slapped Taylor, but another way we might sort of say this, like my hand hit, I mean, this goes back to like old action theory stuff, right? When my hand hit Taylor, I didn't really hit Taylor. And when we're doing that sort of pronoun game, I think really all that we're pointing to is that the slapping question didn't run through my psychology. And there's this sense, I think, sort of theory neutral sense that the things that I'm responsible for should be tied to me in some sense. And that's why like the weather, I can't be responsible for the weather. It's not going to be tied to me in the right sort of way. And so the involuntary gets us, or thinking about things like spasms just helps narrow down a sort of class of things that we can be responsible for. It's got to be tied to our psychologies in some way. And then we can look at the other kinds of features that tend to do this parallel excusing, as it were, across the board. So I talked a little bit about accidents, like Jackson Pollock's drop clause. And the lesson I draw from these kinds of cases is that it's not just conduct that's connected to our psychology, but those features of our conduct that we're responsible for have to actually be represented in our psychology in a certain way. So to be responsible for something, to be basically responsible for something, a condition is that essentially while you're engaged in this while you're being guided by your representations and like responding to the world in various ways, the things that you can be responsible for are the ones that actually show up in your psychology in some way. So things that are truly excluded, things that never occurred to you in any sort of way, would just be sort of side effects of your action, maybe, and things that you brought about in some way, but they won't be things that you can be basically responsible for. You can't be assessed for those. And then the final class of sort of restrictions has to do with certain kinds of mistakes that we can make. So I give an example in the book of someone who's cooking and they just grab the wrong spice. They grab, cayenne powder instead of paprika. Those two things look very similar in the jar, but they're going to make a big difference to the dish because paprika, will give it a kind of sweetness, but cayenne's going to make it a lot spicier, a lot hotter. So if they grab the wrong one, plausibly, at least in certain kinds of cases, that seems like, well, now they're not really accessible for the dish, the way the dish turns out. Yeah. Similarly, like you can think of moral cases where someone just takes a jacket and they think it's their jacket, but it's not their jacket. It's just this like identical looking, very, very similar jacket. And they were all on the bed at the party and they grabbed it and they thought it was theirs. And, they get halfway home when they realize, oh, this isn't my jacket at all. And there's a sense in which they took the jacket, so they kind of stole the jacket, but they're not really accessible. They're not really blameworthy for stealing the jacket. And so I think not only do the sort of features of our conduct have to be represented in our psychology in the right way, but those representations have to be accurate in the ways that matter to the kinds of evaluative standards that we're going to be assessing for. So certain kinds of mistakes don't seem to matter. Whether, I think I give an example in the book of someone who is really disparaging and discriminatory towards someone they think is Amish. And so they sort of, it would be an Amish hate crime or something like that. But it turns out the person they're targeting isn't Amish, but a Mennonite. And the person isn't sophisticated enough to distinguish between the Amish and Mennonite. So they've got a mistake, but the mistake doesn't do any work because the moral standards here don't care about who it is that you're sort of discriminating against. They just care that you're like not respecting them as a person or something like that. But other kinds of mistakes, like in the case of what spice you're adding, that will make a difference to how we assess the dish, right? What spices are used matters to the dish. What sort of particular sect someone belongs to probably isn't going to matter, morally speaking, for that kind of case. And so really we're just operating off this sort of loose idea or this conjecture, really, that if we see these parallel operation across the non-moral and moral cases, then one very plausible hypothesis is that they're affecting something that all the cases share. And so then we can sort of reverse engineer the conditions on the basic responsibility relation by just looking at these sort of parallel operation of excuses and think a bit about then just sort of standard things we sort of expect responsibility to do. It's supposed to be sort of sensitive to our control in some way. It's supposed to tie us to things so that we can be evaluated by them and try and make good then on the basic responsibility relation, being able to satisfy all those considerations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. Well, let's zoom into the moral case and to blameworthiness in particular. How do you take blameworthiness to relate to blame? And how does your account of blameworthiness compare to your account of praiseworthiness?
Yeah, so if we go back to just the sort of simple idea behind the view, that idea is that, look, there's this sort of neutral responsibility relation. It ties us to what we do. When we satisfy the conditions, it ties us to what we do. When we look around at all these cases of evaluation, it sure looks like the same thing could plausibly be said in all the cases. It's that we tie someone to the thing we're assessing. We assess that thing sort of in some way positively or negatively. And then we assess the person based on the assessment of the thing done and the fact that they're responsible for it. And so that's the sort of schema for the view, is that we're responsible for things. We can assess those things roughly positively or negatively. And then we get a positive or negative evaluation of the person as a result. So we see some glorious art in the museum. We find that placard. We say, oh, that person did the thing. That thing's really good. And that reflects positively on that artist, at least insofar as that one painting shows. Maybe the rest of the work will turn out to be trash, but we like that, and that reflects positively on them. And same in the sort of other non-moral realms, whether it's athletically or culinarily, right? Like you're at a potluck and you have something, you're like, oh, who brought the whatever it was that was delicious? Because they did a really good job. And then morally, we do this too. It's like, who are we blaming or thanking for doing something sort of bad or good? And so blameworthiness on this view is just, so if that's the general picture, right, we're sort of responsible for things, they can be, as it were, bad or good, right, negative or positive. Mm-hmm. You're blameworthy when you're responsible for something negative. You're praiseworthy when you're responsible for something good. And then that makes you, and this is almost a cop-out, but that makes you worthy of blame and worthy of praise, which is just to, I know we're going to talk in a little bit sort of more about what it involves to be worthy. But that's my sort of basic schematic idea about how blameworthiness and praiseworthiness works. They're perfectly parallel. The basic responsibility relation ties us to sort of doings, the things that we do. Those doings are evaluated positively or negatively, and blameworthiness is just responsibility for bad doings, and praiseworthiness is responsibility for good doings. Mm-hmm. Suitably understood. That's right. Talking in bad and goodness is just a loose way of talking about negative and positive.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So you already alluded to the idea of worthiness, and your account depends on this idea. So what does it mean to be worthy of blame or praise on your view?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's some things we can say just very generally. So I sometimes treat this as sort of a non-negotiable starting point in thinking about blameworthiness, is that the blameworthy just have to be those that are worthy of blame. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't tell us yet what that worthiness relation is. But I think it has to be sensitive to sort of bidirectionality here, right? It has to be the case that like we understand blameworthiness in part in terms of what it is to be worthy of blame and vice versa. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's just like a linguistic marker, but I think that has to be true. Otherwise, I sort of lose my grip on even what it is that we're talking about if we reject that. That doesn't get us a whole lot, of course, right? It just tells us that, well, there's this worthiness relation, but what kind of worthiness is it? But I think it does give us some clues. So we know that it's going to be a normative relation, that there's going to be some kind of reasons of the right kind that are going to tie or help explain why those that are responsible for doing bad things are worthy of blame. And the way that I think about worthiness in this context, well, so then that tells us something. It's got to be normative. And we know something else, given what I've tried to pitch in the rest of the view, which is that it's going to have to be a non-moral notion of worth.
Right.
Because it's got to do the work across all of these evaluative domains, including the non-moral domains. And I think Jay Wallace was right. We don't typically like morally blame the artist. It's not a moral case when the artist does some shoddy work. And so that means that the worthiness relation is going to be normative, but it can't be moral. And so I draw inspiration from the relation that we find between certain kinds of appraisals and emotions and attitudes and evaluative properties that objects can possess. So this is sort of broadly the Fitting Attitudes project that you find in other areas of philosophy. So sometimes you find it in the theory of value, sometimes you just find it in the theory of emotion. But a good sort of non-moral case that we can look at is the relationship between things, emotions like fear and the property of being fearsome. So there's a kind of normativity, it seems, about a response like fear, what should it be a response to? Well, it should be a response to the fearsome, those things that properly, appropriately generate fear in perceivers or something like that. And you can do this for lots of other attitudes like the admirable and admiration. So there's this whole sort of well-established kind of approach to thinking about these normative properties or these evaluative properties and our responses to them of a certain kind. Right? And there seems to be this tight connection. And if we look at blameworthiness and blame, we see the same kind of markers that we see in those kinds of, in the Fitting Attitudes Project more broadly. So again, we've got the attitude right there, blame, this kind of response, whatever else we want to say about it, it's right there, blameworthiness, right? We could talk about admiration worthiness. Instead, we have admirable, right? Because we know it's not that we're able to admire someone. That's not what makes them admirable. There are some like right reasons involved. And so I think we can draw a parallel there. And much in the same way that I say that the blameworthy thief is responsible in just the same way that the blameworthy artist is, I think that the blameworthy are worthy of blame in just the same way that the fearsome are worthy of fear and the admirable are worthy of admiration. So we can draw on that same kind of schematic approach from the Fitting Attitudes Project to give us an account of worthiness, which I think is a kind of fittingness. So my favorite way of how to understand what that worthiness is across all those instances, admiration, fear, blame, is a kind of fittingness, which is a kind of, I treat as a kind of essentially an accuracy relation. So blame is just a negative, on my view, basic blame is just a negative appraisal of an agent in light of being basically responsible for something bad, essentially. And then the reason they're worthy of blame is because since blame represents them as being basically responsible for something bad, when they're basically responsible for something bad, they're blameworthy. And so blame is just accurately picking out the thing that blame takes the object to be, which is, again, basically responsible for something bad.
Right. Well, the final chapter of your book draws from the tradition of thinking of responsibility in terms of the quote-unquote deep self. How is your view a kind of deep self view?
Yeah, good. So throughout the book, I'm trying to paint this positive picture, this sort of minimalist account of responsibility, but also connect it back to or anchor it in themes that a reader would be familiar with if they were reading these other accounts of responsibility. So if you're familiar with the responsibility literature, I want to make sure that my view sort of connects up with sort of things we might be interested in or reasons we might be interested in thinking about responsibility. And one of those, but it's supposed to connect with those things and be sort of, as it were, maximally parsimonious. I'm not trying to sort of assume too much about how responsibility works. And so one of the things that we might care about when we think about responsibility, and something certainly that other responsibility theorists have cared about, is sort of the way in which responsibility seemingly is connected in some way to ourselves. So we saw this in the example of slapping Taylor, which I now realize we've brought up multiple times, and it's unfortunate to be subjecting you to.
Yeah, that's right. You also mentioned awards season, and I can't think of the Oscars and not think of an infamous slap from a few years ago.
Yeah, good. So good. That slap looks a lot different if it's not guided activity, right? If it's some kind of spasm or if Will Smith's being controlled by magic or something like that.
Right.
So one of the things that sort of the central concerns that responsibility theorists have had is identifying that behavior which is properly ours and that behavior that isn't, right? My digestion, we can talk about the ways in which I'm digesting my food, that doesn't look like it's anything I'm really doing. Of course, it's true of me, the embodied person here, but it's certainly not something that like our responsibility practices seem to care about in any usual sort of case. But the choices that I make, or the way that I interact with others, or typically the things that I say, those do look like they belong to this proper subset of the true things that you can ascribe to me that responsibility might care about. So that's a very long-winded way of saying we want responsibility to be tied to who we are in some sense. Mm-hmm. The standard way that this kind of concern has tended to come out in the literature is sort of a disagreement between theorists who think the stuff that is properly reflective of who I am is revelatory in some way. So when I'm responsible for things, that gives others insight or evidence about some way that I actually am. And then we might develop conditions, therefore, on responsibility that sort of ensure that when I do something, it really does then count as evidence or as revelatory of who I am. So I think a lot of those in the sort of deep self or true self or real self, there's a lot of different sort of flavors of these views, typically take there to be some kind of facts about me that when my action goes the right way, I'll actually be responsible for what I did. And part of what will be preserved then is that there'll be features of my action that are evidence of some way that I really am, some set of core values that I have, some sort of arrangement between my various kinds of psychological states, right? Between my beliefs and my desires, or about my like true desires or properly endorsed desires, or I've done something so that when I act on my psychological states, they'll really be expressive of who I am. And so I don't adopt this kind. The shift in my version or my connection to real self views is that I think when the basic responsibility relation holds, it's not evidence or revelatory of our real selves. The connection is instead sort of quasi-constitutive. That is, when we're basically responsible for things, our conduct, our doings will have features that are tied to our psychologies because of this, the sort of accuracy and representational conditions on the basic responsibility relation. And so it's not evidence of some set of cares or values that were there before that need to be expressed in action. It's rather that our actions just are sort of instantiated, if you like, values or cares. That is, you can tell sort of the same story. It's just it doesn't require that there were these things before that get expressed in action. Rather, the cares sort of come out of our the structure of our actions. And so in some sense, the pithy way is sort of we are what we do, rather than it being the case that we're only responsible when we do things that are properly tied to who we are. I think all we are is what we do, broadly conceived.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. Cool. In the conclusion of your book, you explore some possible extensions of your view. Based on those reflections or on feedback that you've received from other philosophers about the book, are there any developments of your view beyond what you've said so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the moves in the book that I've been thinking about the most since the book has to do with how we understand blame and blaming. So one of the lines of resistance one might have towards this minimal view is to start with our moral practices and to think that when we try and isolate what it is that we're doing when we blame others morally, we're going to get some sort of asymmetries between the moral practices and the non-moral practices. So when we morally blame people, there's going to be something different going on than when we non-morally blame them, even though there might be some sort of superficial or surface level parallels. And so you see this a lot in contemporary approaches to blame that start with a set of attitudes that really look moralized. So again, following in sort of the Strawson tradition, some people just sort of stipulate that, like, well, when I talk about blame, I have in mind a certain form of moral anger, something that looks like, resentment when it's second personal, and indignation when it's third personal, and maybe guilt when it's first personal. And these are going to be sort of moralized notions, but that's how we should start theorizing about blame. And then there's going to be challenges then to how you can accommodate that kind of picture on my more minimally resourced and non-evaluative approach to responsibility. So if we're just going to have this core notion that's very minimal across all these cases, it can't look like resentment. Blame has to look like something else. So one of the moves I make in the book that I think is independently motivated is to sort of distinguish between the thing that the blameworthy are worthy of, so what we might just call blame, that's the thing they're worthy of, and the full set of responses that we direct towards the blameworthy when we sort of count as blaming them. Mm-hmm. So in the book, I draw the distinction by talking about blame and what I call blaming behaviors, which is just this broader set of things that we do towards the blameworthy. And I think it's important to distinguish between these two things anyhow, because the normativity that we talked about when we talked about the relationship between blameworthiness and blame, that, well, they're worthy of blame, I think it's hard to sustain that for the full range of things that we direct towards the blameworthy when we count as blaming them. And you can see this in just sort of perfectly moral cases. You don't even need the non-moral cases to see the problem. You might sort of imagine two different versions of a falling out between friends. So I'll throw the two of you under the bus here. So, Matt and Taylor, you have a disagreement, a falling out, and there's two. So suppose, right, Taylor has wronged Matt, and that's not under dispute. He wronged him, and there's many different ways in which Matt might respond that look like perfectly good candidates for blaming you, Taylor, right? So one might be some sort of confrontational, angry-like blame, right? And there might be an actual confrontation, or it might just be that, Matt talks to others that know the two of you, and it's a sort of confrontation by proxy because he's complaining about things, but it has this sort of like animated, sort of heated, heightened kind of response. But there's another sort of response, or at least a family of responses that's creating more distance, doesn't engage. It might be a kind of like just sort of bummed out that Taylor did this thing. It could be an exclusionary kind of disengagement, like cold shoulders, where, right, just for a period of time, he freezes you out of things. And that's and we can talk about all the sorts of social and interpersonal reasons that might bear on these sorts of things. But it's hard just looking at those two responses to say, like, oh, well, given that Taylor's blameworthy for this, right, the only thing that he's really worthy of is getting yelled at, or the confrontational version of it, rather than the sort of exclusionary, distancing version. And you see a lot in the contemporary literature on blame that no one's really sure how to theorize about blame successfully, because it's got this very heterogeneous nature. Our practices of blaming each other, of holding each other responsible, have all these sorts of dimensions. There's lots of different ways in which we do it. There's lots of different kinds of reasons that seem to bear on like which of those behaviors one morally ought to select. Forget about just like all things considered ought to select. And so I think one sort of strategy forward is to divide up between the kinds of broad responses that we might adopt and behaviors that we might adopt towards the blameworthy because they're blameworthy. So they look like blaming behaviors. They're blame related. It turns on the fact that the person's blameworthy. That's part of the significance for the kinds of behaviors we adopt. but they aren't part of this like tight normative connection between blameworthiness and the thing that the blameworthy are worthy of, namely blame. And so I've been really interested as sort of developing the view for taking this kind of insight that I use in the book just to sort of establish how we can talk about basic blame as really sort of legitimate blame without bringing in all of these sort of moralized, further emotional responses or behavioral kind of notions. And how we can sort of leverage that move to think more about the sort of diversity of interpersonal interactions, the kind of dynamics of blaming each other, and more broadly even than that, the dynamics of holding each other responsible and sort of interacting with each other in this kind of blame and praise space, loosely conceived.
Cool. Well, thanks again for joining us today, Matt. This has been great. Where can listeners go to follow your work?
So the easiest thing to sort of catch up on any work that I have going is just to find my website. It's not as easy as it is for others. Matt King is unfortunately a very common name. And even Matt King Philosophy won't necessarily get you right to it. I think there is a Matthew King who does some sort of continental philosophy somewhere still. But I'm at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, so a simple Matt King UAB ought to find that site, which has a link to my professional site, which is usually, no more than 6 months out of date.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks again, Matt.
Yeah. Thank you.
In our next episode, we will talk about free will and time travel, and our guest will be Neil Tognazzini, professor of philosophy at Western Washington University.